It was the early morning of August 4th, 1940. The world was at war, but most of the fighting so far had been raging across Europe. Few could imagine that, on this distant day, the flames of war would suddenly ignite on the sun-scorched lands of East Africa. As dawn broke over the rugged hills of Abyssinia, thousands of Italian soldiers began their march toward British Somaliland. Their mission was simple yet ambitious: strike fast, strike hard, and claim victory for Mussolini's empire. British Somaliland was not a land of riches or cities. It was dry, desolate, and isolated, but its location was everything. Whoever controlled Somaliland controlled a gateway to the Red Sea, the Middle East, and the trade lifelines of the British Empire. To Mussolini, this small colony was not just a patch of desert, it was a stage to prove that Italy could stand shoulder to shoulder with the great powers of the world. Across the border, a handful of British and colonial troops watched the horizon. They were outnumbered more than 10 to 1, armed with outdated equipment, and cut off from reinforcements. Yet they prepared to stand their ground, knowing that their resistance, however small, would echo far beyond the deserts of Africa. What unfolded over the next few weeks was not just a battle of armies, but a struggle for global influence. The Italian invasion of British Somaliland was meant to be quick and decisive, a show of strength that would inspire allies and intimidate enemies. But as history often proves, even the smallest conflicts can have consequences that ripple across continents. This story is not only about strategy or military might, it is about courage, sacrifice, and the clash of ambition and survival in one of the most overlooked theaters of World War II. We will uncover how this invasion unfolded, why it mattered far more than anyone realized at the time, and how the outcomes in the dusty corners of Africa helped shape the fate of empires. So stay with us as we journey back to 1940, to the forgotten battlefields of British Somaliland, where determination met overwhelming odds, and where history was written in the heat of the desert. If you enjoy uncovering the hidden stories of World War II, the ones that changed the world but never made the headlines, do not forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell. Your support helps us bring these incredible moments from the past back to life. Let us step together into the shadows of history and discover what really happened when Mussolini's forces marched into British Somaliland. As the sun climbed higher over the vast plains of East Africa, shimmering waves of heat distorted the horizon. From the rocky highlands of Abyssinia, the thunder of engines and the rhythmic pounding of boots echoed across the barren landscape. Thousands of Italian soldiers, their khaki uniforms blending with the dust, moved as one immense force toward the invisible border of British Somaliland. The invasion had begun. For weeks, Mussolini's commanders had been preparing this operation in silence. Now, on August 4th, 1940, it unfolded with ruthless precision. Italy had assembled an army of staggering proportions. Official numbers claimed 25,000 men were directly committed to the assault, but in truth, nearly 350,000 troops were stationed throughout Abyssinia, most of them native conscripts led by Italian officers. They came from across the empire, Retrinascaris hardened by years of colonial warfare, Somali auxiliaries familiar with every dune and wadi, and Italian infantry brigades equipped with modern rifles, machine guns, and mortars. Above them, the skies roared with the engines of Italian bombers, their wings glinting in the relentless sun. For this campaign, Mussolini's generals had spared nothing. They had superiority in men, artillery, and aircraft, believing that sheer force would guarantee swift victory. Across the border, the British garrison stood in stark contrast. Fewer than 4 battalions defended the entire colony, barely enough to man the fortifications, let alone resist a full-scale invasion. These soldiers, drawn from British, Indian, and African units, faced overwhelming odds. Their rifles were old, their artillery limited, and their air support almost non-existent. Yet what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in grit and discipline. The officers knew reinforcements would not come in time. The colony was too far, too remote, too expendable in the grand scheme of the global war. But retreat was not an option, not yet. The Italians advanced along 3 axes. To the north, the first column pushed toward Zila, aiming to cut off any British retreat along the coast. In the center, another force moved on Hargeisa, the heart of the colony's interior. To the south, a third column drove toward Wina, seeking to encircle the defenders. The speed and coordination of the offensive caught the British by surprise. Zila fell within 2 days, its defenders forced to abandon their positions under heavy shelling. Hargeisa followed soon after. Despite desperate resistance from colonial troops, dust clouds rose like smoke signals across the desert, marking the relentless progress of the invaders. For Mussolini, this invasion was more than a military maneuver, it was theater. He wanted a spectacle that would echo across Europe and Africa alike, a demonstration of Italian might that would bolster his image as a modern Caesar. His propaganda machine portrayed the campaign as the return of Rome's imperial destiny, the reclaiming of ancient lands that once lay under the shadow of the Roman eagle. The conquest of British Somaliland, though small in scale compared to battles in Europe, was meant to prove that Italy could stand as a true partner to Hitler's Germany in shaping the new order of the world. But within the ranks of his army, the story was far less glorious. Many of the native soldiers fought not for empire or ideology but for survival. Some had been conscripted from villages with promises of food or pay, while others had no choice at all. Under the blazing African sun, they marched for a cause that was not their own. Italian officers pushed them forward with strict discipline. Their commands often barked through translators who struggled to bridge the divide between colonizer and conscript. In the heat and dust, unity was a fragile illusion. Meanwhile, inside British Somaliland, the defenders dug in around the port city of Berbera, the colony's capital and final line of defense. Berbera, perched on the edge of the Gulf of Aden, had little to offer in terms of natural protection. The coastline was treacherous, and the arid hills behind the town offered scant cover. Still, the defenders worked tirelessly, constructing makeshift fortifications and preparing to hold the line as long as possible. To them, this was not about defending a distant empire, it was about duty, pride, and the unspoken belief that even a hopeless stand could mean something. By the second week of August, the Italians were within striking distance of Berbera. Their heavy artillery pounded the British positions day and night, shaking the ground and filling the air with dust and smoke. Each explosion seemed to announce the inevitable. The empire of Mussolini was advancing, and the British stronghold was crumbling. Yet in the chaos, moments of extraordinary courage emerged. Isolated units held out for hours, sometimes days, delaying the Italian advance and buying precious time for evacuation efforts. Stories spread among the troops of a lone machine gun crew that fought until their ammunition was gone, of a group of colonial soldiers who refused to abandon their wounded commander, of officers who stayed behind to cover their men's retreat. These small acts of resistance went largely unnoticed in the grand narrative of the war, but they defined the character of those who fought. The Italians may have had the numbers, the firepower, and the propaganda, but the defenders of British Somaliland had resolve. They fought not for glory or conquest, but for one another, in a land far from home, under a sky that offered no mercy. As Berbera's defenses weakened and evacuation ships prepared to sail, the desert wind carried the sound of distant artillery over the sea. The battle for British Somaliland was drawing to a close, but its significance would reach far beyond its dusty borders. For Mussolini, It was a fleeting triumph, a symbolic victory to display to the world. For the British, it was a lesson in endurance, a reminder that even in defeat, the will to resist could not be extinguished. And so, beneath the unforgiving sun of East Africa, two empires clashed in a struggle that would soon be forgotten by history books, yet remained a testament to the far-reaching tides of a truly global war. Long before the thunder of artillery echoed across its barren hills, British Somaliland had already carried a quiet but immense importance, hidden beneath the vastness of its desert horizon. To the untrained eye, it was a dry, inhospitable land sun-scorched, wind-carved, and seemingly devoid of value. But for strategists in London, Rome, and Berlin, this harsh landscape held the key to something far greater: the control of the Red Sea and the lifeline that connected Europe to the Middle East and the riches of Asia. Its position, near French Somaliland and Djibouti to the west, and the narrow waters of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait to the north, turned it into a critical node in the grand machinery of empire and war. Whoever held this corner of Africa could watch, and perhaps command, the maritime arteries of global power. The Red Sea was more than a strip of water. It was the gateway between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. Through it passed ships laden with oil, troops, and supplies, vessels bound for Suez, Alexandria, or Bombay. In 1940, as Europe burned under the shadow of war, every shipping lane became a battlefield, every harbour a potential stronghold. British Somaliland, though small and forgotten in peacetime, suddenly stood on the fault line of empires. It bordered Italian East Africa to the west and French Somaliland to the northwest, where the port of Djibouti lay just across the frontier. The French, though officially neutral after the armistice with Germany, occupied a position that both sides watched with suspicion. From Djibouti's docks, one could see across the Gulf of Aden toward Arabia, and beyond that, the oil-rich lands that fed the engines of war. To Mussolini, who dreamed of a new Roman Empire stretching from the Alps to the equator, this territory was not merely a piece of land, it was a symbol. Seizing British Somaliland meant more than defeating a colonial outpost. It meant tightening Italy's grip on the Red Sea and projecting power toward the Middle East. Control of the region would allow the Axis to threaten British shipping routes to India and cut off supplies to Egypt, where the British Eighth Army was preparing for the defense of the Suez Canal. The Deuce's generals understood the geography well, with Italian East Africa already encompassing Eritrea, Abyssinia, and Somalia. British Somaliland was the missing piece that would unify the entire Horn of Africa under their banner. From the British perspective, however, the territory was both vital and vulnerable. The colony's ports, especially Berbera, offered refueling stations for naval patrols guarding the Red Sea. Its airfields, primitive but functional, provided bases for reconnaissance missions, and its proximity to Aden, just across the Gulf, made it a defensive buffer for the British presence in Arabia. Losing it would not only endanger regional trade but also embolden Italy's ambitions in the Middle East. London strategists knew this, but resources were stretched thin. With the war raging in Europe and North Africa, reinforcements were impossible. The defenders of British Somaliland were left to hold their ground, knowing full well that their colony was a pawn in a much larger game. As the Italian columns pressed deeper into the desert, they understood exactly what they were fighting for. The Red Sea's waters glimmered like liquid silver beyond the distant hills, a constant reminder of why they were there. Every advance brought them closer to that strategic prize. Their generals imagined a triumphant march to the coast, Italian flags rising above the port of Berbera, and warships sailing freely through the strait under their protection. In Mussolini's mind, victory here would echo from Rome to Berlin, proving that Italy could command the sea routes of empire. just as the ancient Romans had ruled the Mediterranean. But the landscape itself seemed determined to resist them. The heat was relentless, the dust storms unpredictable. Supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of miles of barren terrain, and water was scarcer than ammunition. Many of the native troops, hardened though they were, began to feel the strain. Still, the promise of victory, the weight of propaganda, and the watchful eyes of Italian officers drove them forward. On the British side, the defenders clung to their positions with quiet determination. They understood that every day they held out was another day the Red Sea remained open to Allied ships. From the air, Italian bombers roared overhead, targeting supply depots and defensive lines, but also photographing the intricate coastline that curved like a scimitar around the Gulf of Aden. Below, convoys of camels and trucks wound their way through rocky passes, carrying ammunition, food, and wounded men. The rhythm of war was dictated not by the speed of machines, but by the endurance of those who moved through the unforgiving desert. To both sides, the land felt endless, a test of resolve as much as strategy. Meanwhile, across the water, British warships in Aden watched the unfolding conflict with increasing concern. The Royal Navy knew that if Berbera fell, Italian aircraft could threaten the Red Sea convoys that supplied the British armies in Egypt. The sea lanes, once peaceful, would become vulnerable to raids and blockades. The fall of British Somaliland would not end the war, but it would tilt the balance of control in a region where geography was destiny. As the battle drew closer to the coast, the true stakes of this campaign became clear. It was not merely about flags and borders, it was about who would command the lifeblood of global trade. The Italians, driven by visions of empire, sought to choke Britain's supply lines and extend their dominion. The British, fighting against overwhelming odds, sought only to buy time to hold out until the tides of war shifted in their favor. In those scorching August days of 1940, as the sun set over the Gulf and the air shimmered with heat and dust, British Somaliland became more than a forgotten colony on the edge of empire. It became a symbol of resilience, of strategy, and of the far-reaching consequences of global ambition. Every hill, every wadi, every stretch of desert carried the echoes of a struggle that was as much about geography as it was about survival. The Red Sea shimmered just beyond the horizon, indifferent yet vital, its waters bearing silent witness to the clash of two empires fighting not only for land, but for the power to shape the course of history itself. As the Italian forces advanced relentlessly across the arid plains, the British defenders in Somaliland understood the grim reality before them. They were not there to win a glorious victory or to turn the tide of war in East Africa. Their orders were simpler, yet far heavier in meaning: to resist as long as possible, to bleed the enemy where they could, and to withdraw only when the cost of staying outweighed the value of the ground itself. It was a plan born from necessity, not from ambition. The British Empire was stretched thin across continents, fighting for survival in Europe and North Africa, and British Somaliland, isolated and outnumbered, had become a lonely outpost in a crumbling line of defense. After France's fall earlier that summer, the world had shifted dramatically. The tricolor that once flew over Djibouti, just beyond the border, no longer represented an ally but a question mark. Would the forces of Vichy France cooperate with the Axis, or remain neutral? No one could say for sure. What the British knew, however, was that any hope of reinforcement or supplies from the French side had vanished overnight. The fall of France did not just change the politics of Europe, it severed lifelines across Africa. British Somaliland, once buffered by friendly territories, now stood alone, an island of defiance surrounded by uncertainty and hostility. In London, war planners debated whether the colony could be defended at all. Some argued it was expendable, a token presence too far from the main theaters of war to justify the loss of men and material. But others saw its symbolic value. To abandon Somaliland without a fight would embolden Mussolini and send the wrong message to both allies and enemies. And so, a decision was made to fight. To delay, to make the Italians pay dearly for every mile of desert they crossed. Even a small stand in a forgotten corner of Africa could serve a larger purpose, to show that the British Empire, even in retreat, would never surrender without resistance. On the ground, the reality was brutal. The defenders numbered fewer than 5,000, drawn from British, Indian, and African units. Their weapons were old, their artillery limited, and their air support almost non-existent. Yet they fortified what positions they could: hilltops, riverbeds, narrow passes using the harsh landscape as both shield and trap. Every ridge became a potential stronghold, every valley a line of fire. They knew that when the Italian columns came, they would come in force, with tanks, aircraft, and tens of thousands of men. But they also knew the desert favored those who understood it, and many of the local troops had been born under that same scorching sun. They moved like shadows across the dunes, setting ambushes, sabotaging supply lines, and disappearing before the enemy could respond. The first clashes were fierce and desperate. Italian aircraft bombed British positions, sending dust and smoke spiraling into the sky, while columns of infantry advanced under the blazing heat. Yet the defenders held firm, trading ground for time, retreating only when ordered, and always making the invaders fight for every inch. Reports filtered back to London that the British troops in Somaliland were outnumbered 20-1, but still refusing to break. Their commander understood that his mission was not to hold the colony indefinitely, it was to delay the Italian advance, to buy precious days or weeks for the British to strengthen their positions elsewhere along the Red Sea. But isolation took its toll. Communication with Aden became erratic, and supply ships struggled to reach the port of Berbera without drawing enemy attention. Ammunition began to run low, and the men rationed every bullet, every drop of fuel. In the desert, survival depended not only on courage but on endurance, and each day under the relentless sun chipped away at both. Still, they pressed on, sustained by duty and the knowledge that every hour they held out meant another hour. The Italian forces were tied down, unable to redeploy elsewhere. Meanwhile, the Italians, confident in their numerical superiority, began to encircle the defenders. Their generals saw the British resistance as a mere nuisance, a last flicker of defiance before inevitable surrender. But the British strategy was deliberate: withdraw when necessary, regroup, and strike when opportunity allowed. Small mobile units carried out hit-and-run attacks, using the rough terrain to their advantage. It was not a battle for conquest but for survival, and in that struggle, they found a grim sense of purpose. When word finally came that evacuation would be necessary, it was received not with relief but with quiet resolve. The order did not mean defeat, it meant completion of the mission. The defenders had done what they had been sent to do: resist, inflict losses, and preserve as many lives as possible for battles yet to come. Plans were laid to withdraw toward the coast, where Royal Navy ships would be waiting under cover of night. It was a race against time and against the tightening grip of the Italian army. As the final convoys began their descent toward Berbera, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Trucks and men moved through clouds of dust, engines roaring, while aircraft buzzed overhead. Yet even in retreat, discipline held. The last units to leave covered the withdrawal of their comrades, ensuring no one was left behind. From the hills, they could see the shimmering outline of the sea, the promise of safety just beyond reach. And as the first transports began to load, they looked back at the land they had defended, barren, unforgiving, yet now forever marked by their stand. By the time the last British troops departed, the Italians marched into Berbera to find little more than empty fortifications and silence. The defenders had vanished into the night, taking with them not only their weapons but the pride of having defied an empire. The Italian victory, though swift on paper, came at a cost far greater than they had anticipated. For the British, the loss of Somaliland was temporary. The courage displayed there would be remembered long after the dust had settled. In the end, the campaign in British Somaliland was not a story of conquest or defeat, it was a story of resolve. It showed that even when surrounded, cut off, and outnumbered, determination could turn a doomed defense into a symbol of endurance. The colony's isolation had made victory impossible, but it had also revealed the strength of those who refused to surrender easily. And as the ships sailed away across the Gulf of Aden, their decks crowded with wary soldiers watching the coast fade into the horizon, they carried with them the quiet dignity of men who had fulfilled their duty, standing firm against the odds, and reminding the world that even in retreat, honor could still be found in the fight. While the fighting raged under the burning sun of East Africa, far to the north, in the cold halls of Berlin, another war was being shaped, one that would soon engulf continents and change the course of human history. The clash in British Somaliland, though small and seemingly distant, was unfolding against the backdrop of an enormous geopolitical storm. As Mussolini's troops pushed through the rocky ridges and sand-choked passes of the Horn of Africa, Adolf Hitler sat in his war room, surrounded by maps that stretched from the Atlantic to the Urals. His eyes were not on the deserts of Africa, but on the fertile plains of Europe and the East, where he envisioned a vast empire that would eclipse all others. To him, the African campaign was a sideshow, an extension of his allies' ambition, but in truth, every front, no matter how remote, was a thread in the fabric of his larger plan. In the summer of 1940, Europe had fallen silent after the thunder of conquest. France had been crushed in mere weeks, leaving the world stunned. The once mighty British expeditionary force had barely escaped at Dunkirk, and now Britain stood alone, an island defying the storm. In the corridors of power, Hitler believed that England's resistance was doomed, that soon the British would either negotiate or collapse under pressure. Yet as the Luftwaffe prepared to pound the skies over Britain, his mind was already wandering eastward to the vast territories of the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, though still a secret idea on paper, was beginning to take form, a dream of conquest that promised living space, resources, and total domination. Meanwhile, Mussolini sought to prove that Italy was more than a junior partner in this axis of power. His invasion of British Somaliland was part of a larger attempt to carve out an empire of his own, to emulate Rome's ancient glory, and to win the recognition of his German ally. The Duke's ambitions were driven not only by strategy but by pride. He wanted to show Hitler that Italy, too, could claim victories, that Italian soldiers could conquer lands and shape history. Thus, while Hitler planned grand campaigns across Europe, Mussolini focused his gaze on the dusty expanses of East Africa, where he believed swift victories could bolster Italy's prestige and secure his place beside Germany at the table of conquerors. Yet the global web of war was far more intricate than either dictator imagined. The battles in East Africa were not isolated, they were part of a chain reaction that rippled through the world's strategic balance. As Italian forces advanced in Somaliland, Britain was forced to divert attention and resources from other critical fronts. Each desert skirmish, each evacuation, had consequences that extended beyond Africa's borders. The Royal Navy, already stretched thin in the Mediterranean, now had to protect convoys across the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. Air patrols from Aden to Egypt were increased, and new defensive lines were hastily drawn across the Middle East. In this way, a single campaign in a forgotten corner of Africa subtly reshaped the movements of fleets and armies thousands of miles away. At the same time, Hitler was watching the Mediterranean with growing impatience. He admired Mussolini's boldness but doubted his capability. When reports reached him that Italian advances in Africa were slower than expected, he dismissed them as unimportant, convinced that the real victory would come in Europe. His focus turned to the skies above Britain, where the Battle of Britain had begun, a fierce contest that would determine whether his forces could cross the English Channel. Yet even as German bombers roared over London, the seeds of a far greater gamble were being planted. The Führer believed that once Britain was subdued or isolated beyond recovery, he could turn eastward to strike at Stalin. The Soviet Union, with its vast lands and endless resources, was his ultimate prize. Back in East Africa, however, the war felt very different. For the men fighting in the heat and dust, global politics meant little. They did not know of Hitler's secret plans or Mussolini's ambitions. They fought for survival, for honor, for the small victories that mattered in the moment. But the decisions made in distant capitals would soon dictate their fate. The isolation of British Somaliland after France's collapse, the lack of reinforcements from Europe, the shifting priorities of the empire, all were the direct result of the wider war that was tightening its grip on the world. By late 1940, the pattern of conflict was clear. While Hitler built his war machine in Europe, Mussolini's empire strained under the weight of its ambitions. The Italian forces in Africa found themselves overextended, their supply lines fragile, their resources limited. The British, though forced to retreat from Somaliland, regrouped in neighboring Aden and Kenya, preparing for counter-offensives that would eventually reverse the tide. The African campaign, once heralded as a quick victory, became a burden that sapped Italy's strength at a time when Germany needed a strong ally. As Hitler's plans for the invasion of the Soviet Union matured, the Axis alliance began to show its cracks. Mussolini's setbacks in Africa and Greece forced Germany to intervene repeatedly, drawing precious resources away from the Eastern Front preparations. In hindsight, the campaign in British Somaliland and the broader East African War were small preludes to the catastrophic overstretch that would later define the Axis powers. The idea of global dominance, so confidently imagined in 1940, was already being undermined by the complexity of a world too vast and unpredictable to control. From the deserts of Africa to the forests of Eastern Europe, the threads of war were tightening into a single, unbreakable web. Every decision, every campaign, every loss or victory was connected. The British retreat from Somaliland was not a mere footnote, it was a reflection of the Empire's struggle to fight on multiple fronts at once. The Italian triumph, though celebrated in Rome, was hollow and fleeting, and in Berlin, even as Hitler dreamed of new conquests, he failed to see how the battles in distant lands, fought by men he would never meet, were quietly shaping the fate of his own ambitions. Thus, the war in East Africa stood as a symbol of the world's entanglement, a reminder that in the Second World War, no battle was truly remote, no victory isolated, and no defeat without consequence. The fighting in Somaliland, unfolding beneath the burning African sun, was a whisper compared to the thunder that would soon shake Europe. But it was a whisper that echoed through the corridors of power, reminding all who listened that the fate of nations was being decided not just in the grand theatres of Europe, but in every corner of the world where men fought and fell beneath the same uncertain sky. By mid-August 1940, the dust of war had settled over the rocky hills and barren plains of British Somaliland. The Italians, moving with speed and precision, had captured key towns such as Zila, Hargeisa, and finally Berbera, the colony's capital and last bastion of resistance. Their flag rose over the port city as the British forces withdrew across the Gulf of Aden to Aden itself. The campaign was over in just a matter of days, and Mussolini proudly proclaimed victory. It was a symbolic triumph, a shining jewel meant to prove that the Italian Empire could rival its German ally and challenge the old imperial powers. But beneath the surface of celebration, the truth was more complex. For the British, the fall of Somaliland was a tactical retreat, not a defeat of spirit. The defense had been hopeless from the start. Outnumbered, outgunned, and cut off from reinforcements. Yet those who fought there delayed the Italian advance just long enough to regroup, analyze the enemy's weaknesses, and prepare for the counter-offensives that would come months later. In that, the campaign became more than a brief colonial struggle. It became a lesson in resilience, a reminder that even the smallest stand could ripple across the grand design of global strategy. For Italy, however, the victory brought fleeting satisfaction. The rapid conquest gave Mussolini the headlines he craved, but it also planted the seeds of overconfidence. As the months passed, Italian forces stretched further across East Africa, occupying vast territories but facing mounting logistical nightmares. Supply lines crumbled, morale faltered, and the once victorious troops soon found themselves on the defensive. By 1941, British and Commonwealth forces would return, sweeping across the Horn of Africa and reclaiming every inch of lost ground. What had once seemed like a triumph turned into a costly illusion, a brief blaze that burned out under the weight of reality. Yet the deeper importance of the British Somaliland campaign lay not in the territory itself, but in what it revealed about the nature of modern war. World War II was not confined to the trenches of Europe or the skies over Britain. It was a truly global conflict, where events in one corner of the world could alter the course of strategy in another. When the Italians captured Somaliland, it forced Britain to reevaluate its entire East African position. Resources had to be shifted, naval patrols strengthened, and alliances reinforced. The defense of the Red Sea, the security of Middle Eastern oil, and the stability of the Suez Canal were all indirectly affected by this seemingly small colonial battle. Meanwhile, Hitler's gaze remained fixed on Europe, unaware or perhaps unconcerned that the ambitions of his ally in Africa would soon draw German forces into new and costly commitments. The interconnected nature of the war meant that Mussolini's moves, however minor they seemed, had consequences that would reverberate across the Axis strategy. Germany's need to support Italy in Africa, Greece, and later the Balkans would delay its invasion of the Soviet Union by crucial weeks, a delay that would prove fatal when the Russian winter set in. Thus, the campaign in British Somaliland stands as a microcosm of the global web of World War II. It showed how every decision, every front, every local battle was tied to the fate of empires. It was not just about armies clashing in the desert, it was about pride, politics, logistics, and the illusion of control in a world unraveling at every edge. In retrospect, the men who fought under the scorching African sun might not have known that their struggle was part of something far greater than themselves. But history has a way of revealing the hidden threads that bind small moments to great consequences. The fall of British Somaliland was one such thread, thin but unbroken, stretching from the dusty hills of Africa to the war rooms of London, Berlin, and Rome. It was a story of courage and overreach, of loss and learning, of the intricate connections that define every era of conflict. And perhaps that is the lasting lesson of this forgotten chapter. War is never truly distant. What happens in one place, no matter how remote, echoes through the world. Every victory comes with a cost. Every conquest carries consequences. And every act of defiance, no matter how small, can shape the tide of history. As we close this story of British Somaliland's brief but significant campaign, we are reminded that even in the most overlooked corners of history lie the clues to understanding the larger forces that shaped our world. The soldiers who fought there, British, Italian, and African alike, played their part in a drama far bigger than themselves. Their courage, endurance, and sacrifice deserve to be remembered, not just as footnotes of empire, but as the beating pulse of a war that reached every continent. Thank you for joining us on this journey through time, through dust, fire, and determination. If you found this story fascinating, and if you want to continue exploring the hidden battles and untold histories that shaped World War II, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and ring the notification bell. Your support helps us uncover more of these forgotten moments and bring them back to life. Because history is not just a collection of old dates and names, it is the story of humanity itself, of choices made and prices paid. And sometimes, it is in the smallest battles, fought in the most remote places, that we find the truest reflection of our shared past.